We are live. This is Asia Tech Podcast on a Tuesday evening. Asia Matters. Graham Brown in the Asia Tech Podcast studio. Joined by Daniel Hanley. Welcome.
Thank you, Graham.
And Priyanka Nadkarni.
Hi.
Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thanks for coming. We're going to talk about why Asia matters tonight. We're going to talk about the top stories of the hour in news anchor terms. What's going on in Asia? A lot crosses our feed in the LinkedIn world. We'll help the listeners and viewers unpack some of that. What are the big stories this week? The format is that we introduce the stories and just open up if people want to ask questions or talk away, chat away about why they think it's important. I am just the facilitator this evening as opposed to the interviewer. So please pitch in with your questions and answers. Anybody watching along at home, feel free to flame us or add in comments, constructive criticism. If they're watching on the archive, feel free to hit that like button in the face, subscribe to our channel, add your commentary. We'll put all the details of our guests tonight in the show notes. So if you want to connect with them, reach out to them. Or if they say something contentious, then you know where to take your beef. So let's kick off. Let's talk about why Asia matters tonight. Let's talk about the top story of the hour. If we can jump in, we're going to throw up on the video. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll see the video as we talk along. If you're listening on audio, let me just describe what the top news stories are. We've got to start talking about the man himself, Jack Ma. So let's open up this TechCrunch article. So there's a lot of talk this month about Jack Ma retiring. Is he, isn't he? What's going on? Priyanka, this was your story.
Yes.
Tell us, what's going on?
Yes.
Do you believe, is he retiring?
So this one was an interesting one. It came up by a former colleague of mine on his LinkedIn news feed. So it's Gary Cien, and he saw the New York Times article, which was released on a Friday, which is Friday September the 7th, I think, and obviously shared it along with all the majors and shared it around the world. And it said Jack Ma to retire, which, does something to most people, including, I think it was more than 2% of their $420 billion market cap. And it took till the next day on the Saturday for Jack Ma to actually get on to South China Morning Post, which I think they own, to sort of say, no, I'm going to release news on Monday, but I'm not retiring. And it so happened that he wasn't retiring, so to speak. He's just putting a succession plan into place, and that the current CEO will move into the chairman role, and he will continue on the board for another decade. And he wants to focus on philanthropy and in particular education. So there was two interesting pieces for me on this. The first being fake news and how do you curb that as an organisation? And certainly, he owns a newspaper, but what else could have been done to go quicker than a day afterwards to dispel some news? Obviously, the stock price has gone back up, but in the moment. And then the second is obviously he's moving on to do bigger and better things.
I like that though.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Bill Gates obviously has sort of blazed a trail in a way. I think it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you talk about. I mean, everybody. I guess when they talk about iconic CEOs, we always sort of led to believe Steve Jobs was like the pinnacle of that. And Bill Gates, when he retired, he set up the foundation and he gave away half his wealth. And it wasn't just, a few billion, it's like $40 billion, right? And he just doesn't get half the publicity or the niceties that Steve Jobs does. But, and now Jack Ma's doing this. I wonder what will become of it. Whether or not, what kind of compels somebody to do something like that? It's like, do they get bored, or are they onto bigger things? Or what's sort of in their mind? Why do they think I'm going to go and, commit myself to philanthropy? Surely he could do a lot as the CEO of Alibaba.
I mean, to be honest, he's not got that much left to prove, right? So when you look at the figures of Alibaba, I think they took on their Singles Day last year, this year actually, they took around $25 billion in a day. 60,000
transactions.
It's just
transactions
incredible.
A second, right?
And when you compare that, for example, to a Black Friday and Cyber Monday combined, the total sales for those two events was around 7 billion.
Yeah.
So this is a monster company that he's built. And
do you think he's just got bored because the challenge has run out?
So I love his vision, because if you look at what he said in when he actually announced it, he spent the last sort of 10 years building a team that's capable of actually taking over. So he's been building leaders. He's been investing in his team. And when you look at the big CEOs, like you mentioned, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, one of the things that you see with all of them is that they are trying to hire the best talents, and they always tell you that it's about getting the best people on board. And for 10 years, he's been building that, and he's sort of taken the company to a point where he's gone and said, it's over to you guys now. Like, yeah. I've done my bit, and you need to sort of...
Do you think he has done his bit? Do you think it's sort of, he could do more? Because... Or is it just that you get bored? You've built one of the biggest companies in the world. What do you do now? Do you continue building it? I mean, if you were Jeff Bezos, you might go and build a rocket ship and fly to Mars or whatever it is he's trying to do. But, what is the challenge that possesses people like that? The next stage?
I'll let you know when I get to that
about
stage.
To say, yeah, give us a couple of years.
There you go. All right. Okay. Give you a chance to catch up.
But, I think, he was a teacher to begin with, so that's what he's going back to in education, and that's lovely. And I've read obviously a lot about him, and he seems like a really genuine person. And so I think he's one of my favorite quotes from this news story feed has been him saying, I don't want to die in the office, I want to die on the beach.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So he's obviously got
he's thinking ahead.
He's thinking
have you do you know much about him in his former years? Because I know there's a few stories that come out, and you talk about him being a teacher as an example. There's sort of some odd stories that pop up from time to time. Like I heard when he went to the States and he was sitting in Starbucks somewhere, wherever it was in the West Coast, and he was sort of thinking of like, what should I call this company? And he was sort of drinking a coffee, and he said to the waitress, he pulled her over, and he goes, "Oh, do you know Alibaba?" And she said, "Yes, open sesame." And he went, "Exactly," like that. And that was his sort of rationale for picking the story. But it sort of seems quite an oddball type story but it sort of gives an insight into him and how he thinks, right? He's not sort of like a big technological visionary. He's just worried about whether people would understand what he's trying to do. It's sort of that teacher mindset as well, if you like. And there's some other odd ones where he met, who was it that came to the Great Wall of China when he was a guide? Where's that story? So maybe somebody can dig that one out. I think it might have been it's either like one of the founders of Twitter or Jerry Yang from Yahoo, for example, somebody can correct me on this, he came to China and showed this guy around, and it was Jack Ma as a guide at the time when he was nothing. He wasn't even like starting Alibaba, for example. There's some interesting backstories to him.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know too much. I don't know.
No, I don't have the stories. I mean, I know obviously he had some stint teaching, which is kind of interesting to go from a teaching role to growing one of the biggest e-commerce companies in the world. But the thing that gets me about Alibaba is, I probably come across it maybe 10 years ago. When it was known at that time as a sort of online, almost a poor man's Amazon, right? With sort of, there was an idea that the goods were sort of a lower quality, and where you see it is today, you have all the international brands, like all the Western brands, really becoming involved in that platform because they know how important it is to the Chinese market. And I mean, the Chinese market, you've got a sort of growing middle class, right? So you've got a target around 500 million middle class consumers, and it's huge. So he's kind of grown that. And I mean, I was in China recently, and what amazes me, and I think people from outside of maybe this region, they don't really appreciate Alipay, for example.
Yeah.
Like Alipay, in the region of 400 million users. I mean, nobody in China is using cash. Wherever you go, it's Alipay everywhere. And I just think that there's so many things that he's done and that company has done to sort of shape, the e-commerce and also, moving into fintech in China. It's amazing.
Did you get to see any of the Hema stores there, the Alibaba stores?
I didn't see them, but I've heard about them. And it's like, again, it's we see a similar thing now, obviously, Amazon and it's just a huge success story, and I think it's going to.
Well, what do you think he's done for Asian entrepreneurs? Because think about it, who are the well-known Asian entrepreneurs globally? And he is really the only one that we know, especially sort of from East Asia or from China. I mean, people obviously recognize he's got that sort of, he's that funny-faced guy that appears at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, and there he is speaking to Donald Trump, right? So he's got a recognizable face, and he can speak pretty good English as well. There are not many people out there. I mean, if you think about the second biggest company in that space, Tencent, Pony Ma. Does anyone know what Pony Ma looks like? Could you recognize, unless you know that space? I mean, there's nobody close to that. From Asia, who do we have? I mean, there's a lot of Indian entrepreneurs that are well known within India, right? And then maybe from this area, you've got like Tony Fernandez from AirAsia, right?
Yeah.
But who else is there out there? SoftBank guy, that's it. But nobody would recognize him, right? So he's probably the most visible guy, in the world in that space. And that's probably done a lot, hasn't it? Because now, if you're an entrepreneur in Asia, you have somebody that kind of looks like you, right? And you think, okay, that's now possible that I could do that.
I mean, he's on the world stage. Like you say, he is there. It's almost like a state visit when he visits, prime ministers and heads of state. He gets treated on that level, and I think what he's done is he's given a sort of a voice, right, to the rest of the world in terms of China being able to compete in that space on a global level. So,
and in a non-threatening way as well.
Absolutely, and the thing I like about him, his interviews, he's actually pretty straight talker. Yeah, like he's and he accepts criticism pretty well. He deals with it quite well, and he just gives his opinion. And he doesn't get involved in too much of the
politics,
trash talk.
Oh, okay.
Right? He just sort of lets it go over him and says his piece, and
Yeah, I like that. I think he's probably the most. If China had to have a PR strategy, he would be it. He's the most successful PR strategy for them. He's sort of very soft power, for China, right? He's a very positive face for them.
Yeah.
So that's the story of Jack Ma. Let's move on. Let's talk about the second story. We are now switching gears here. We're going to Jakarta. We're going to talk about Go-Jek. So, Daniel, I know you know Jakarta quite well. Can you talk a little bit about Go-Jek first? Because it's not well known to the people outside of Asia. What's going on? What is Go-Jek?
So, I mean, this is the other interesting thing, right? So Go-Jek, and you talk about well-known, business guys from Asia. And Go-Jek, I think, is Indonesia's first and only unicorn. And I mean, it comes from the Indonesian Ojek, right? So Ojek is your motorbike taxi, and Go-Jek is basically a ride-hailing app. It started out where you, instead of jumping on an Ojek on the street corner, you're able to actually book your taxi. And in Jakarta, because of the traffic, it's just crazy, right? So the ability to be able to just book something to turn up and jump on and have a fixed fare, it just really took the hassle and the pain out of the journey. So it started off as a ride-hailing, and then Go-Jek, they started to bring in more services, more features. So you had GoSend, which was a courier service. You had GoFood. You had different apps, and it's kind of evolved. So I lived in Jakarta for a little bit. So my wife is Indonesian. And I mean, when we go to Jakarta, she literally lives on Go-Jek.
Right.
I mean, if she wants a coffee, she orders it on Go-Jek.
Well, they bring the coffee.
They bring the coffee, right? Because you can't go.
Do they bring it in one of those bags?
Yeah, they bring it in the bag.
So such a Southeast Asian thing, like
with
a straw in
you
it.
Can't. It's going to take you like an hour to go and get the coffee, right? Because the traffic's so bad. But if you want, if I need something for my son from the pharmacy, it's Go-Jek. We get Go-Jek. If I need to send documents across town, it's Go-Jek. They have Go Clean. They send cleaners to your house. Yeah. So it's just it's evolved into this sort of lifestyle app, and again they're adding more and more. So they're bringing in different features. Again, one of the really cool features they have now is the Go Pay, right? So again, in Indonesia, you've got sort of 60% of the population being unbanked. Right, so from a fintech perspective, the ability for them to be able to use their phone to pay for services and eventually get loans and things like that, it's really becoming a lifestyle app, and it's kind of really important now, part of the ecosystem in Indonesia. So, but the interesting thing this week was that it looks like they have just raised another $2 billion.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I mean, it's amazing, and they're looking to really accelerate their expansion into the rest of Asia.
What will that buy them? I mean, 2 billion. I mean, I know they've got backers, including Tencent in Temasek here in Singapore. So I mean, you've got some of the best investors in Asia there. But what would 2 billion
what
really
do you spend 2 billion on? This is the thing.
Well,
so I mean, they're
exactly.
going after acquisitions, right?
Right.
So they're making acquisitions as they go. They're looking at the Vietnam market, right? So there's 100 million people in Vietnam, and Vietnam motorbikes. It's similar sort of things. So they're starting off. I think.
Do they only do motorbikes? They don't have cars? I mean, like, are they there with Grab? 'Cause Grab
they're
would be
there, yeah. So they have cars now, and they. So they're sort of moving into that space as well. I think what you're seeing now is all out war, right? With Grab and Go-Jek, because they're
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think Vietnam's already been sort of, if not started, I think they launched their app.
Yeah. Go-Viet.
Go-Viet.
Yes.
It's a really interesting. There's two pieces to this for me. One is the competition, and I just genuinely think that's when with the players that we do have in Southeast Asia at the moment, being Uber's gone, so we've got Grab and the local taxi market in most of these countries. So I certainly think that's a great opportunity from a competition perspective, and hence why they've got the backing. But what you mentioned also before around the ecosystem play. That's going to be an interesting one and a challenge. And like, I'd like to see how that plays out in other markets, because obviously they know the Indonesian market incredibly well, and so that's an easy plug and play sort of situation. And it reminds me of WeChat and what that has turned into, but that's taken So how do you scale that up fast in the markets?
Even that hasn't translated to like payments outside of China. It's been tough, isn't it? WeChat, but not WePay in other markets, right?
Yeah. So I think, obviously with $2 billion, I'm sure you'll put your investments in the right spot and figure out how to do it. But the other interesting play for me, and it's purely from a branding perspective, is they're actually going out and being even more localized than Grab.
Yeah.
And Grab, my personal belief is Grab won the market because they were a local solution to Uber, for example.
In what way? Because there's a lot of discourse about that. What do you think that Grab did that Uber... I mean, there's been talk, for example, that they allowed their drivers on a Friday to go to prayer, for example, because a lot of the drivers are Muslim, for example. There's small things like that, but it seems like a bit anecdotal. But what do you think they actually did right there?
See, I have a marketing background, so I can see that as a branding to start with. So I can see how they were branded local, they communicated local, so they did that in a very purposeful way. We're not the big international player, we're the brand for you here. That's worked for them, obviously. But Go-Jek's plans have almost, like, they've got Go-Jek and then they've got Go-Viet, and they're almost going even more local. I mean, I was jokingly saying, what's gonna be the Singapore version of that? Go Sing or Go La. Or what is that going to look like?
Yeah. Because there's been a few ride-hailing apps coming into Singapore after the Uber exit. I mean, there's been a few which are trying to be like more localized, but I think their problem is they don't have the resources, do they? Yep. So you wouldn't book it because they don't have enough taxis on board. It's sort of like the two-sided model. You need to throw a lot of money at it to make it work and stick, right? And that's the problem. But maybe these guys could do it here in Singapore. Or do you think it's saturated?
So no, I mean, for me, the interesting thing and what I like about the way Go-Jek approached this is that when they started out, they're actually solving a real-world issue, right? Which is the traffic issue in Jakarta. And that was the focus. And I think that's the difference between Go-Jek and Grab is that Grab, obviously coming from Singapore, doesn't have that same challenge. It was literally a competition to Uber. And then I think the reason they added all the services on is because they needed to keep the drivers busy during the day. So they started adding all these other services on top, and eventually you got the kind of network effect. And again, you know, people from outside of Asia or people that haven't been to Indonesia, they don't realize how integral now Go-Jek has become as part of the ecosystem. So I think if they can focus in the same way in some of these markets where you have similar challenges, which would be, you know, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh, Manila, Bangkok, then I can see them actually doing well. But again, I mean, Grab are there now as well with the Grab bike. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And but I see this. I mean, these two have you know, huge potential moving forward, because it is a lifestyle app now. It's much more than sort of ride hailing. I mean, you as I said, you can literally live with Go-Jek.
Yeah.
What do you think about, I mean, in terms of the comparison between Go-Jek and Grab? I mean, I've got some numbers here just as an example. I mean, Grab is obviously, if you live here in Singapore or if you're in Malaysia, it's extremely familiar, right? And you probably spend a lot of money on Grab because it's so easy, right?
Too much.
Like Grab bill every month. It's like horrific, right? I mean, how did that ever happen? And then you sort of let your kids on Grab as well, and then it's like, okay, there you go. But now we sort of like, I mean, there's some interesting data here about comparing Grab and Go-Jek. Just the numbers here, a little bit out of date, but you get the gist here. In terms of drivers itself, Go-Jek 250,000 versus Grab 100,000. That was in 2017. So, I mean, Go-Jek has significantly more. I mean, obviously it's easier because they're motorbikes, most of those, right? And Jakarta as well is huge by comparison.
And I think they were obviously Jakarta, the population. And I think when they actually launched, they literally had stadiums, and they invited the drivers to come to the stadium, and they did it en masse, and they really went hard and tried to scale quickly. So.
Right. What were they doing there? It was just like a big recruitment drive.
A big recruitment drive.
Yeah.
In a stadium.
But, you know, what we're looking at this, and maybe we just need to also think about it differently. And what you said, you pick the right markets, because we as a region have, I don't know, what is it? How many in Southeast Asia? How many countries in Southeast Asia, all with different populations and different needs, and different challenges. So if we go back to what you were saying, pick the right markets, the ones in which that play to the strength of the actual motorbikes and the traffic. I think that will be. I can see them struggling in Singapore, but yeah, in Thailand, in those other bike.
Heavily popular, right? Because the other thing that's interesting about these guys is that they have a business intelligence play here, right? Because they're capturing so much data about who's going from where to where, which stores are being, they're buying stuff from. So they're collecting all this data in the background, which they're obviously using to focus the product. And
do you think that's actually key to their development long term? Because we've gone back, if we sort of jump back to Alibaba where we started off today, one of the things that I find that if you come from outside of Asia and you think about these brands like Alibaba, and now we're talking about these brands like Go-Jek and Grab, for example, they're gathering billions of data sets about their consumers, right? And in the West, quote unquote, now if you do that, you know, at some point you get into trouble. And we've seen this with Facebook, for example. You know, at some point that comes up and bites you, right? Where here in Asia, it's almost like that's then used as a competitive advantage. I mean, for example, if you talk about Alibaba, you know, in terms of the data sets it's gathering about what you're buying, where you're going, like who you're interacting with and everything, because it's got all these kind of different touch points with you. You're walking into a retail store, you're buying something with Alipay and so on. Now, whether or not it's ethical, that then drives their ability to evolve the service, and then they can compete with Amazon, right? Because Amazon probably can't get away with the kind of things that an Alibaba can get away with in terms of the gathering of data. Maybe Amazon only can dream about what they do with the data, right? But at the end of the day, that helps them create a better service. And that means they'll be more competitive on the global stage. So you can look at Go-Jek and Grab, for example. Maybe they can do that. And that means they could then be more competitive and better than Uber, because Uber can't get away with the kind of things it can get away with.
Yeah, My view on this though is that I don't think even in the Western companies that they're being regulated heavily enough. If you have a look at what people can do with the data and how you can contact people with the data, that was really, I mean, GDPR was probably the first, and that was in May this year, and that was European. So I haven't seen strong enough legislation in the States to be able to say. I mean, I think Google will take over the world someday. So that's
well,
my.
now in
that's
China,
done. And then we'll have Alibaba do the same. But for the meantime, without the regulation, everyone's using the competitive. That data, the data companies first and service companies second.
Yeah, definitely. Interesting area as well. I mean, today we sat down and went through this in terms of that sort of big data collection. One of the interviews that I did here on Age Tech Podcast was, again, we got into the blockchain space. I'm not a blockchain guy, but when you kind of explain all of that in the context of blockchain, now I start to understand it, that now we're moving into an era where we're creating all these massive data sets, connected to individuals. But, the whole internet as we know it isn't set up to do that. So you've got all these guys going on about blockchain, opening up a new space. I know this is your area, so I'm not going to kind of open the rabbit hole now, but...
No, but it's interesting. And again, even in blockchain, there's considerations around GDPR, right? So once you're writing this stuff onto the blockchain, it's there forever. So how do you remove it? But at the same time, there are opportunities to allow individuals to manage their sort of data and who get access to it and how they get access and at what cost, right? So I think it could evolve sort of naturally if the technology can actually come to fruition. But I mean, at the moment, there's just not the regulation here. There's not the focus on regulation.
I guess what the point I wanted to kind of find out is, are we in a different position here in Asia with all of that in terms of like access to data, blockchain, regulation, and so on, that gives them an advantage over where they are in the West? Or I'm just curious. I mean, because what you guys see, because some people come here and they don't understand just kind of what's going on. What are your thoughts?
Is there an advantage for Asian companies?
Yeah.
I think definitely. There isn't the focus. We don't have those Facebook type companies yet. I mean, we have Alibaba coming, who are sort of responsible for collecting the data. So any organization is going to take full advantage of the data they have in order to get them the maximum advantage until somebody tells them that's not cool. So I think, it's just make hay while the sun is shining.
Exactly, get away with it.
There's plenty of companies here that we've seen that have, asked for, do it first, ask for permission later. Or what is it? No, sorry, I kind of...
Seek permission rather than forgiveness.
Yeah,
or the other way around. No, the other way around. Seek forgiveness rather than permission. All right, okay, we're moving on then. We're going to talk about large brands now, because we have here, if we can flick up the next story, we're going to look at the Profit 2018 Brand Relevance Index. And there's a particular focus here on Chinese brands. So do you know much about the Brand Relevance Index? Do you come across this one? Because there's a lot of different brand indexes published on a regular basis. It's the one at the bottom. Yeah, the second one there. Sorry, the LinkedIn story, if we can just pop that one up. There's a lot of these kind of brand index published about brand ranking and brand equity and brand power and all these kind of things. And they tend to be quite sort of biased as well by the countries they come out of, right? Do you follow this one much at all, Priyanka?
I do. I'm not as familiar with this specific one, but there was this specific article had some quite interesting findings throughout it, but they all measure differently. So this one, there are the ones that actually measure the brand value on the basis of how much you could sell it off on your P&L. This one is more of a relationship, like it felt to me like it was an index based on what people thought about brands.
Right, engagement and So rather than it be about how much is a brand valued. So that's the difference I see in terms of valuation. So is that top 50 there? We can flip back up to the top. That top 50 highlighted there. This is the top 50 that they've come up with, right? Based on this graphic here with Alipay or Alibaba at the top.
This is in China.
Right. So these are with Chinese brands. I mean, if you have a look, I mean, if you're not watching this one on the video, just let's scroll through quickly who are in the top 10 then. We have Alipay, we have, I guess that's Android, isn't it, not rather than Google. That's WeChat, Huawei, Microsoft, Taobao, which is Alibaba again, isn't it? And then Intel, this one I can't read. Meituan, that's the retailer, isn't it? What's that one? I can't remember.
10 cents?
Yeah, 10 cents. Sorry, yeah, exactly. I was going to say QQ, silly me. And then Tmall. Right, so there we go. Interestingly, not many Western brands in there. I wonder how that's changed over time. What are your thoughts?
I was just about to say, though, I wonder, that's the latest one.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see that even a couple of years ago, because I bet there were a lot more Western brands a couple of years ago, because we've seen a lot of pressure on non-Chinese brands sort of trying to compete now. Obviously, we've got the trade wars about to kick in, so that's, you're going to get more challenging. And I think that the Chinese company, they're catching up, and I think the Chinese consumer now are actually looking at their own homegrown products, and that, again, that quality issue is becoming sort of less and less, and they're able to compete. So I think it's only going to become more and more. Yeah,
no. If you'd asked me even 2 years ago, I was working for an Australian bank, so we did a lot of, we had a lot of conversations around what Australian products and how do they go into China, and it was very much all the consumer insights were saying that having that quality issue, specifically from in anything in the health sectors or in the food and beverage sectors, all wanted to be coming from outside. Your brands were your outside, and there was also that that luxury factor of, if you were having a brand from outside of China, you were seen to be more luxurious, and therefore that's what the consumer behaviour was going for. Yeah. So this is really lovely to see that this is now a trend that's coming back to focusing on the Chinese brands doing better for their own people.
Do we have any, I'm curious, I mean, I can't sort of like pick it out from this list here, but any sort of, not lifestyle brands, but I suppose, like lifestyle brands, beyond the obviously tech brands that are Chinese? Because I remember, if you go back a few years when sort of China was emerging, there's a lot of stories about Western brands going into China. They're the obvious ones. And then there were some sort of anomalies like Kappa, who did the old football jackets, but they kind of got into China and reinvented themselves. I think they were bought by a Chinese entrepreneur who reinvented this sort of Italian brand, and it became a big thing. But there was no sort of like Chinese brands, and there was only really, I mean, the nearest they had was like Li Ning that did the shoes, the basketball player, and they had these sort of like Nike kind of knockoffs, right? But there was no Chinese lifestyle brand. Are we there? Are there any on this list? I mean, we've got all the tech brands, but can we flick that back up again? I'm just wondering if there's any there yet, any that are producing like clothing or food or anything like that. I mean, Adidas obviously, but they're not Chinese, are they? So no, I mean, they're all sort of like luxury where there would be the French LMVH and all those kind of things. But then there's the I mean, I don't see anything there.
No, you're right. Actually, I don't think. I think
Oppo.
It is. Yeah.
There you go, handsets. But that's about it, isn't it? I'm just wondering how long we're going to be with that. Because if you look at the progression of sort of Asian economies, if you take, for example, Japan, which has sort of gone through that curve from being an economy which kind of completely absorbed all Western brands that were thrown at it. It was like crazy about Fendi and Gucci and all those sort of like lifestyle brands. And then it started producing its own. And they didn't they had the sort of luxury brands it tried to compete internationally with, but they weren't sort of at that level. It had like the Issey Miyakis and people like that. But then it had sort of the more cool street brands that, I'm trying to think of the names, but there would be like the jeans brands like Evisu, for example, which compete internationally, but they're really micro. They still haven't sort of got to that stage apart from on the tech side.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I was going to say, I think it's going to come, right? Because, Chinese citizens today, they're spreading further and further, and they're having more opportunity to travel and to, to come back. And the sheer size of the market there, something like a $5 trillion retail market in 2016 in China, which is incredible. And the forecast is, I think, around 60% of global sort of e-commerce is going to be China-based by 2020. So I think it's just a natural progression. Technology, they're there. So if you look at Huawei, for example, some of the features on the new phone are just, incredible. So
no longer cheap.
They're not. But when you look at, some of the features with the triple camera on the new phone, it's high spec.
So we did some, just some general research on a couple of the brand indexes earlier, and Brand Finance this year said that 15 out of the top 50 brands in the world were Chinese, and that's by value. Now, obviously, that's also based on the fact that in China you've just got a larger population. But the interesting piece that we found was that these were the fastest movers were these ecosystem brands. So what we talked about, Go-Jek, basically taking over someone's life and penetrating in multiple areas of someone's life. They're the brands that are growing the fastest. So in terms of whether or not we'll see lifestyle brands, whether or not they can get a part of the ecosystem, that's probably another question as well.
Yeah.
How do the brands fit into these ecosystem brands?
What do you think of this? Just as an example, I think it's a good case study, Luckin coffee. What do you think about this one? I mean, I don't know if you actually had a Luckin coffee in China, but it's been touted as like the potential Starbucks beater. I mean, it may beat Starbucks in China because it may have an advantage, obviously, with the knowledge of the local market. But just in terms of that ability to beat Starbucks, because I think that Starbucks, like Amazon, is probably one of the best brands globally. I mean, if you look at Instagram, it's the #1 shared hashtag, which is commercial, right? And none of those adverts are driven by Starbucks. It's all people taking photos of their coffee. So it has a very, very strong connection. It has a very strong brand story and, a lot of emotional engagement. Can something like Luckin beat Starbucks? I mean, that's an interesting case study because it's not necessarily, it could be about technology. They could beat Starbucks by having a better access to, like user data, the big data about user experience, payments, and so on. But ultimately, that human touch, could they beat Starbucks at that? Could a Chinese company do it? What are your thoughts?
So what I see is that, in China is one thing. So I see marketing in general, and Priyanka, you know better than me, but it's a different way of engaging in China, completely different. Different mindset. You need a different approach. But what's interesting is that I find that a lot of the Chinese companies really struggle actually marketing themselves outside of China. Yeah. So it kind of it works both ways because I get approached by a lot of the manufacturers for some of the technologies. And some of the marketing and the literature and their approach, and if you meet with them and the way they present and the information they give you during it's just
terrible.
It is
as it is. I know.
I'm thinking this is a real issue here because this is not how you market. And they've got some really interesting products, but their approach is just wrong. So a product like this. In China, maybe they can be successful, and probably they don't need to market themselves outside of China. But it's going to be interesting if they do make that step, because you don't see that many of these sort of brands making the step outside of China. And if they do, they're not successful because their marketing isn't.
Yeah, but I 100% agree with you. I've seen it, but I also. I like the Asian century that we're in, and I like the shift that it's making. So the reason why Starbucks is so popular is because it's an American brand, and it's meant to be about that luxury of having an American brand. So, but now we've got Crazy Rich Asians, and we've got this change where it's okay to have luxury Asian products, and I would like to see that. I think it's now, it will shift towards that. But the challenge will be in the meantime. Maybe they'll get $2 billion of investment to be able to get out there. But I definitely think it's possible. Yeah.
I think one of the challenges we're facing is the storytelling aspect, isn't it? Is that in China it makes sense. However, when you take that brand globally, whether it's a luxury brand or a coffee brand or a tech brand, and a great example is Huawei. You know, what is the origin of Huawei? Like, most people can't even say it properly, and most people don't know where it comes from. Is it Korean or it's Japanese? Now we're kind of waking up to the fact it's Chinese, especially if you're outside of Asia, you're getting used to it. It's not in US on the retail market, right? So the challenge is that, you know, what do these brands mean? I mean, we all know Apple and Steve Jobs, right? We all know that story, and that's a powerful part of the brand story, isn't it? I mean, how important that is for telling that story and what Apple's all about and so on, that person and his story. And to an extent, Nokia was extremely successful because it had that story about, you know, those guys in Finland, you know, they started off making rubber boots, and then they had a factory like cutting wood, and it was that Finnish toughness. And you had the Nokia 3 series, which you could throw out of a building, and it could drop 10 stories and, you know, make a hole in the floor and it'd still be all right, right? So that story existed. Whereas Huawei, we don't know. And they're not very good at telling that story. And I think this is the challenge, isn't it? Like, all those sort of Western brands, especially American brands, are really good at storytelling. Like Starbucks, like Howard Schultz, you know, he went to Italy on a holiday with his wife, and he saw them, like, you know, tamping coffee and making coffee, and, you know, it was like love and it was art. And he thought, wow, this is really going to work in America. And he brought that story back with him. Whereas, you know, those sort of Asian brands where they're sort of catching up is they're learning it's not just about great marketing, it's about great storytelling. And that's where they're sort of not used to it, right? I mean, we've got Jack Ma out there, right? But there's nobody else out there on that platform telling a story about brands. So I think that's kind of what needs to happen next, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a lovely company called MakeBlock that I've just done a project with, and they've got a great story. They're education with robotics education, and they're all around the world, and their story's great, and they're telling it in a really, you know, sort of from the heart perspective. They're talking about education, and they're talking about why it's important to have their founders a young entrepreneur, and I think those will be the next generation of great stories that we see come through from China to I mean, they're in Europe. They're all around the world. So I think
hopefully we'll see more of that.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the time, there's too much focus on the technology, as you say. Whereas the likes of Apple and Microsoft, you know, they realized a long time ago that it's not about the technology, right? You got to position yourself in terms of that whole user experience and the lifestyle and what you can do and what the brand values are. And I don't think that a lot of the companies coming out of China have got their head around that. And the other thing that's really difficult, though, is that, you know, the language barrier is so severe that I don't know how Huawei are actually positioning themselves in China. Right, you know, to that market, and for sure they're doing a good job, but it's difficult to make these judgments because
we're gonna need a Chinese person speaking
person. Yeah, there you go.
Come in here.
There's work to do.
Yeah.
All right, fascinating. We did a round trip of Asia tonight. We talked about, just in review, Jack Ma and his retirement. Is he? Isn't he? Fake news, but the reality there. Thanks for that, Priyanka. And when we went to Jakarta to have a look at Go-Jek, Daniel, obviously some insight there as well. Thanks for sharing that story. And then we ended up talking about the Profit Brand Relevance Index, looking into the lives and consumer behavior, brand engagement of Chinese consumers. We'll put all the details in the show notes. Thank you so much to my guests this evening, Daniel Hanley and Priyanka Nadkarni. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
And thanks for sharing your opinions. We'll put your details in the show notes as well. So as I said, if anybody has anything they want to follow up on, they know where to go. This is Asia Manners. Thank you so much. This is a wrap.